The signal screamed out of the void like a dying breath that refused to fade, repeating every 47 seconds, distorted by centuries of cosmic noise, older than every human colony ship ever launched, older than faster-than-light travel itself. Commander Elias Rourke heard it for the first time at Deep Space Array 12 and felt something cold settle in his chest because signals like this did not come from living civilizations, they came from graves. The technicians had almost dismissed it as background radiation until the pattern repeated perfectly, again and again, an unmistakable distress call encoded in a structure no natural phenomenon could create. It had been traveling through space for 203 years. Whatever sent it was supposed to be dust. Rourke ordered the room sealed and the data locked because some messages were not meant to be public until someone decided what kind of monster they might wake. The translation algorithms finished their work an hour later, and the room fell silent as the words scrolled across the screen, asking for help from anyone still alive, from anyone who believed mercy still existed in the universe, from anyone who could hear them before extinction finished the job. The timestamp embedded in the signal predated humanity's first interstellar probe by a century. Someone had been screaming into the dark long before humans knew the dark could answer. Rourke forwarded the data straight to Earth Command without commentary, because commentary would have broken the spell, and because part of him already knew what the answer would be. Humanity had never been good at ignoring cries for help, even when the help arrived impossibly late. The council chamber on Earth filled with the usual arguments about risk and relevance and politics, voices insisting the senders were long dead, that the galaxy had moved on, that ancient wars were not humanity's responsibility. But the room changed when the astrophysicists confirmed the trajectory of the signal pointed to a system still emitting industrial energy signatures. Someone was there. Someone was alive. The signal had not ended because no one had been left to turn it off. Admiral Naomi Cade listened without speaking, fingers folded, eyes fixed on the star map hovering above the table, watching the red pulsing marker of the ancient call blinking patiently like it had for 2 centuries, waiting for someone decent enough to answer. When the room quieted, she stood and said only that humanity did not measure morality in response times, and that being late did not excuse doing nothing. The vote that followed was shorter than anyone expected. A fleet was authorized not because it was safe or strategic, but because ignoring the call would have changed what humans believed about themselves. The ships chosen were not ceremonial explorers or diplomats, but heavy cruisers and carriers pulled from frontier patrols, vessels built to fight things that refused to negotiate. As the fleet assembled above Earth, the crews were told the truth, that the people they were going to save might already be dead, that the war they might face could be older than their grandparents' grandparents, and that there would be no medals for answering too late. No one stood down. On the bridge of the UES Resolute, Rourke watched Earth recede into a blue marble and wondered who had first sent the call, what they had looked like, and whether they had died believing the universe was empty. The jump to faster-than-light swallowed the fleet and flung them toward a system listed in pre-contact archives as uninhabited because no one had ever updated the file. As days passed in transit, fragments of the signal revealed more detail, references to orbital bombardment, forced labor, a name spoken like a curse again and again, the Threxian Dominion. Intelligence pulled what little it could from scattered alien records and found a pattern that made analysts uncomfortable. Worlds going quiet on the edge of known space, cultures erased so completely that no one remembered they had existed. A predator empire that ruled by erasing witnesses. The fleet emerged from FTL at the edge of the system and immediately cut engines because the planet below them was not dead. It was scarred. Massive orbital structures ringed it like shackles, black and angular, bristling with weapons, while the surface showed faint city lights clustered in controlled zones surrounded by vast dark regions stripped bare. Long-range sensors detected population centers underground, energy signatures consistent with forced habitation, and defensive arrays designed to keep people in, not enemies out. Someone was farming a civilization. Admiral Cade ordered passive scans only, and the fleet drifted like ghosts while data poured in, confirming the unthinkable. The species that sent the distress call still existed, reduced, enslaved, and taught over generations that no one ever came when they begged. A recording intercepted from the surface played over the brooch speakers, a public broadcast in a language translated as ritual submission, children reciting loyalty oaths to unseen masters, adults thanking the Dominion for sparing them another cycle of extinction. Rourke felt his jaw tighten as the final fragment of the ancient distress call decrypted fully and revealed its closing line, a sentence never before translated, a whisper meant for the future, saying that if anyone heard them after they were gone, at least remember that they tried to survive. Somewhere in the darkness below, millions lived under the weight of that belief, that survival meant obedience and hope was a lie told by dead ancestors. Cade broke the silence by ordering a tight orbit and a full tactical assessment, her voice calm in a way that made seasoned officers uneasy, because it was the calm she used before wars that rewrote maps. As the fleet maneuvered, a Dominion patrol cruiser slid into sensor range, ancient but powerful, its hull marked with symbols of conquest dating back longer than human history. It broadcast a warning on all channels, demanding identification and immediate withdrawal, confident in the assumption that whoever had arrived would leave like everyone else always had. Cade looked at the signal timer still blinking on her console, and then at the enemy ship holding orbit over a world that had been screaming for 200 years. She authorized a single transmission, not to the Dominion, but to the planet below, a narrow-band message aimed deep underground, using frequencies the old distress call once used, and as it transmitted, she spoke softly so the crew and anyone listening would hear it the same way. "We heard you. We're late. We're here anyway." If you're listening to this and want to see what happens next, stay close, because history just woke up angry, and what follows is something worth remembering and sharing with anyone who still believes help never comes. The Dominion cruiser powered weapons in response, and the fleet's warning lights flickered to life as unknown contacts surged from the far side of the planet. And in the darkness of that ancient system, the first guns of a forgotten war began to turn toward humanity. The Dominion cruiser fired first, because tyrannies always do when they sense disbelief instead of fear. A lance of particle fire caught across the void toward the Resolute, bright enough to paint the scarred planet below in stark white for a heartbeat. But the human fleet did not scatter or retreat. The beam struck the Resolute's forward shields and dispersed like water on stone, the impact rippling harmlessly across layers of defensive fields the Dominion had never encountered before. For the first time in 2 centuries, the attackers met a force that did not flinch. Admiral Cade did not order a full barrage, she ordered restraint. Human ships slid into precise formation, overlapping fields of fire, locking into a lattice that boxed the Dominion cruiser in without firing another shot. It was a message more unsettling than destruction. We can end you whenever we choose. The Dominion captain demanded surrender again, voice sharp with practiced dominance, insisting this system was under eternal protection and that resistance would result in planetary punishment. Cade replied on an open channel, her tone almost conversational, stating that the system was now under humanitarian intervention and that any further hostile action would be interpreted as consent to regime termination. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant the other side was deciding whether this was a bluff. It wasn't. When the cruiser fired a second time, Cade nodded once and authorized precision fire.
Human rail cannon spoke in silence, slugs crossing the distance at relativistic speed, punching through Dominion armor like it was ceremonial plating. The cruiser's weapons went dark, then its engines, then its communications, each strike surgical and final, leaving the hull drifting, intact but helpless, a predator declawed in front of its prey. Cheers did not erupt on the human bridges. No one celebrated. Every officer understood this was not victory, only introduction. Long-range sensors flared as dozens of Dominion warships emerged from hidden orbits, older designs optimized for suppression rather than war, surrounding the planet in a tightening net. Below them, in subterranean cities carved deep into bedrock, the enslaved species felt the tremor of battle through layers of stone and steel. They gathered in silence around ancient receivers built from half-remembered schematics, devices forbidden by Dominion law, but secretly maintained by elders who refused to let the old signal die. When Cade's message reached them, transmitted on the same desperate frequency their ancestors had once used, the word spread faster than fear ever had. We heard you. We're late. We're here anyway. Some wept because hope had been a myth used to control children. Others laughed hysterically, certain it was a cruel trick. The oldest among them, those who had memorized the distress call as a mourning ritual, recognized the cadence immediately. This was no Dominion lie. This was a response. Above the planet, the human fleet shifted, carriers opening like steel flowers as fighter wings launched in disciplined waves, not rushing to attack, but establishing orbital corridors, clearing space between the planet and the stars. Dominion ships attempted to close ranks, but human vessels moved with unsettling coordination, predicting maneuvers before they happened, cutting off escape vectors, and forcing the attackers into disadvantageous positions.
Each human strike targeted command nodes and control relays, avoiding the planet entirely, refusing to risk the people below even when it would have been easier to scorch the sky clean. Dominion commanders broadcast threats of annihilation, promising to punish the surface for human defiance, but their weapons never fired. Human electronic warfare flooded their systems, ancient Dominion tech buckling under floods of adaptive code designed to dismantle authoritarian control structures. Ships went blind, formations broke, panic crept into voices that had never known it. Rourke watched feeds from the surface as Dominion overseers froze mid-command, their control implants dead, their authority suddenly fragile and very human. For the first time in generations, the enslaved species saw their masters hesitate. Cade authorized the next phase, and the fleet deployed atmospheric dropships carrying not soldiers but engineers, medics, and translators, their hulls marked with symbols that meant nothing to the Dominion and everything to humanity. Aid before conquest, rescue before revenge. The Dominion fleet, crippled and disorganized, attempted a coordinated retreat, but Cade let them go, marking their trajectories for later because she wanted the galaxy to see this. She wanted the Dominion to tell the story. As the first human ships broke atmosphere, descending toward the battered surface, the underground cities erupted into motion. Doors sealed for centuries opened. People climbed toward the light with shaking limbs, emerging to see the sky filled not with shackles, but with descending fire that resolved into vessels of impossible design. Legends took shape in metal and flame. A child standing on a cracked plaza asked if the ancestors had come back, and an elder answered through tears that no, this was something even stranger. This was someone who had heard a cry from 200 years ago and refused to pretend it was too late. Human boots touched alien soil, and no weapons were raised toward the civilians, only open hands and scanners sweeping for injuries long ignored. Cade addressed the planet openly then, broadcasting to every receiver still functional, telling them they were no longer property, no longer alone, and that the war was not over, but their silence was.
In orbit, the last Dominion ships vanished into FTL, carrying news of a species that answered distress calls centuries late and treated lateness as no excuse. Above a world that had learned hope was dangerous, the human fleet held position, shields bright against the stars, not leaving, not rushing, staying as long as it took. The galaxy would remember this moment not as a battle, but as the day a legend arrived exactly when it was needed.
The Dominion did not retreat in defeat, they retreated in calculation, and the moment their ships vanished into faster-than-light corridors, Admiral Cade knew the real war had just begun. Long-range human arrays tracked the jump signatures and painted a terrifying picture, not of a fleeing armada, but of messengers racing toward Dominion core systems, carrying proof that the old order could bleed. On the surface, the human landing teams worked under skies still thick with ash and orbital debris, moving through cities that had forgotten what unguarded movement felt like. The enslaved species emerged cautiously, expecting punishment for every step taken without permission, flinching at the sound of human equipment until translators finally bridged the gap and the truth settled in, fragile and unreal, that no one was coming to chain them back down. Medics treated injuries centuries old, scars passed down through generations, while engineers restored power grids the Dominion had deliberately kept unstable to maintain fear. Every restored light felt like an act of rebellion. Every healed wound felt like an apology humanity could never fully give. In orbit, Captain Rourke oversaw the deployment of planetary defense satellites not aimed outward in conquest, but inward in protection, forming a shield against the inevitable return. Dominion doctrine had always relied on isolation, on making sure no one ever arrived in time, and humanity had shattered that principle by arriving at all. As the first planetary broadcast towers came back online, Cade authorized a system-wide transmission, not a declaration of war, but a statement of presence, explaining in calm, unyielding terms that the people below were under human protection and that any attempt to reclaim them would be met with proportional but decisive response. The message was deliberately sent unencrypted, allowed to leak into every listening post and shadow network across the spiral arms. Somewhere in the dark, other enslaved worlds heard it and felt something dangerous stir. The Dominion response arrived faster than expected, not in ships, but in voices. A representative counselor appeared on the human command screens, its image distorted by antiquated protocols, its tone dripping with outrage and wounded authority. It accused humanity of violating ancient accords, of destabilizing regional order, of stealing property under the guise of morality. Cade listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. And when the counselor finished, she asked a single question that cut deeper than any weapon. How many distress calls have you ignored because they were inconvenient? The counselor did not answer. Instead, it issued an ultimatum, demanding immediate human withdrawal and threatening system-wide retaliation if compliance was not met within one standard cycle. Cade ended the transmission without responding, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any speech. In the subterranean cities, word of the ultimatum spread like a cold wind. Fear resurfaced, old and familiar, whispering that hope always came with a price and that punishments were never far behind. Elders gathered, debating whether humanity would truly stay when the Dominion returned in force, whether this rescue was another chapter in a long history of abandonment. Cade descended to the surface then, against every advisory, standing unarmored in a public square, surrounded by beings who had every reason to doubt her. She spoke plainly, without ceremony, telling them that humanity had found their call in a forgotten archive, that it had taken 2 centuries to reach them because space was vast and mistakes were made, but that leaving now would make those mistakes unforgivable. She told them that humans were not heroes, that they were often late, often flawed, but that once they arrived, they stayed until the job was done.
Her words were recorded, shared, dissected, and carried far beyond the planet, finding their way into black markets of information and rebel channels that the Dominion believed it controlled. In orbit, sensors flared again as an anomalous energy signature bloomed at the edge of the system, not a fleet, but something worse, a Dominion suppression construct, ancient and rarely deployed, designed to sterilize resistance without the political cost of invasion. Rourke recognized the pattern immediately and felt his stomach drop. These constructs did not negotiate, they erased. Cade ordered the fleet to full readiness, recalling landing teams and tightening the defensive net, while analysts confirmed the impossible truth that the Dominion was willing to annihilate an entire system rather than allow the idea of rescue to survive. On the surface, the sky darkened unnaturally as the construct's influence began to bend local space, and panic threatened to undo everything humanity had rebuilt in days. Cade addressed the planet one last time before the engagement, telling them to shelter, to trust, and to remember that this was the moment the galaxy would decide what kind of species humans really were. As the suppression construct crossed the threshold into firing range, dwarfing even the largest human carriers, Dominion signals flooded the system, declaring the planet condemned and humanity warned. Cade gave the order to engage, knowing full well that no human fleet had ever faced such a weapon and survived, and as the first exchange lit the void with blinding force, she realized with grim clarity that answering the distress call might cost humanity everything they had built among the stars.
The suppression construct did not move like a ship. It unfolded like a judgment, vast segments of black geometry rotating into alignment as space itself seemed to recoil around it. Human sensors screamed with conflicting data as physics bent under technologies older than recorded Dominion history, weapons designed to end wars by making resistance irrelevant. Admiral Cade watched the construct's energy profile climb past theoretical limits and felt the quiet settle over the bridge, the kind that came when everyone understood there would be no retreat, no clever maneuver to undo what was coming. She ordered the fleet into a layered defense, carriers and cruisers interlocking fields, while smaller vessels positioned themselves as living shields between the construct and the planet below. The first discharge struck without warning, a wave of annihilating force that erased a human frigate from existence, not exploding it, not breaking it apart, but removing it so completely that only a distortion in space marked where it had been. Gasps rippled through the fleet, not of fear, but of comprehension. This weapon did not kill, it unmade. Cade did not flinch. She authorized counterfire, and human weapons hammered the construct with everything they had: kinetic slugs, energy beams, experimental systems cleared for use only in extinction-level scenarios. The fire washed across the construct's surface and did almost nothing. Its armor absorbed, redirected, and adapted, ancient systems waking from long dormancy to meet modern threats with cold efficiency. On the planet, the sky burned with impossible colors, and the liberated people huddled in shelters that had once been prisons, listening to the thunder of a battle they knew was being fought for their right to exist. Elders clutched children and whispered that this was why hope was forbidden, because it invited monsters. In orbit, Captain Rourke rerouted power manually as automated systems failed under cascading interference, keeping the Resolute operational through sheer human stubbornness. Reports flooded in of ships damaged, of crews holding fractured hulls together long enough to maintain shield coverage over the planet. Still, the construct advanced, its next firing sequence already charging, aimed not at the fleet, but directly at the surface. Dominion transmissions returned then, triumphant and merciless, informing humanity that their lesson would be remembered for generations and that mercy had been offered and refused. Cade muted the channel and made a decision that would define humanity forever. She ordered the fleet to cease conventional fire.
For a heartbeat, confusion reigned, officers staring at their displays in disbelief as the construct's weapon charge climbed unchecked. Then Cade authorized Project Long Echo, a contingency buried so deep in human doctrine that even some captains believed it was theoretical. Deep within the Resolute, systems older than the ship itself came online, powered by algorithms derived from humanity's earliest FTL failures, equations that treated space-time not as a barrier, but as a medium that could be scarred. Long Echo was not a weapon meant to destroy an enemy. It was meant to make a statement across time. As the construct fired its second wave, Long Echo activated, and the void screamed. The human fleet vanished from normal sensor space, not jumping away, not fleeing, but slipping into a deliberate, controlled distortion that wrapped around the construct's firing arc. The annihilation wave struck nothing, dissipating into a warped pocket of space-time that fed the energy back into itself. Dominion observers watched in horror as the construct's own power destabilized its core. For the first time since its creation, the suppression construct hesitated. On the surface, gravity wavered, and lights flickered as the sky seemed to fold inward, a terrifying reminder that the humans protecting them were wielding forces even their masters feared to touch. Rourke felt the strain as Long Echo tore at the fleet's cohesion, alarms blaring as hulls groaned under stresses never meant to be sustained. But he also saw something else in the data, a vulnerability, a feedback loop the Dominion had never considered because no one had ever dared to push the construct this hard. Cade saw it too, and she smiled grimly, knowing the cost would be severe. She ordered the fleet to hold the distortion at maximum output, even as ships began to fail one by one, sacrificing themselves to peep the window open. Dominion commands flooded the system with frantic orders to disengage, to shut the construct down before it tore itself apart, but it was too late. The weapon meant to erase resistance had become a liability, its ancient safeguards overwhelmed by a species willing to break the rules of reality itself to protect a promise made 200 years late. As the construct's core destabilized, a final surge built, not outward but inward, threatening to collapse into a singularity that would consume everything nearby, including the planet. Cade realized with chilling clarity that stopping it now would require a choice no one should ever have to make.
Admiral Cade did not hesitate, but the hesitation happened everywhere else, in the tightening of throats and the stilling of hands as the reality of the choice spread across the fleet. The suppression construct's collapsing core was seconds from forming a singularity, a gravitational wound that would swallow the planet and every life humanity had come to save. Long Echo was holding the distortion barely stable, but the strain was catastrophic, human ships flickering out of existence as space-time shredded their frames. There was only one way to stop the collapse, and it meant feeding the construct something it could not consume without destroying itself completely. Cade opened a fleet-wide channel, her voice steady, stripped of ceremony, telling them that she was authorizing a controlled overload of Long Echo, a maneuver that would anchor the distortion to a single mass and collapse it inward safely, far from the planet. Every captain understood the implication instantly. The anchor had to be massive, deliberate, and willing. The Resolute fit the requirements perfectly. Protests erupted, officers arguing protocol, captains offering their own ships, but Cade silenced them with a single sentence that would echo through human history. "We answered the call. We finished the answer." She transferred command to Rourke and began evacuation procedures, ordering every non-essential crew member to abandon ship while there was still time. Rourke fought her, voice breaking as he argued that the fleet needed her, that humanity needed her. But Cade only smiled faintly and told him that leadership meant knowing when to stay behind so others could go home.
Escape pods launched in waves, streaking toward Allied vessels as the Resolute drifted into position, aligning itself with the heart of the distortion. On the planet below, seismic alarms wailed as gravity surged and receded, and the liberated people looked skyward, sensing that something irreversible was happening. Elders realized with dawning horror that the humans were paying a price far greater than they had ever asked of those they saved.
Cade stood alone on the bridge as the last pod cleared, watching the construct's energy spiral inward, its ancient systems screaming as Long Echo forced it to confront a reality it was never designed to endure. Dominion channels cut back in then, not with threats, but with panic, commanders begging humanity to disengage, offering concessions, treaties, anything to stop the collapse. Cade did not respond. She initiated the final sequence, locking the Resolute's mass and drive signature into the distortion's anchor point. The ship shuddered as forces beyond measurement tore at its hull, alarms fading one by one as systems overloaded. Cade recorded a final message, not for command, not for history, but for the people below, telling them that their lives mattered, that their survival was not an accident or a bargaining chip, and that no empire had the right to decide they were expendable. As the singularity stabilized and began to collapse inward, dragging the suppression construct with it, a blinding flash consumed the space where the Resolute had been. The distortion snapped shut, leaving behind a scar in the void and a silence so profound it felt like mourning. The planet was safe. The Dominion weapon was gone. The cost was unthinkable. Rourke took command of the fleet in a daze, ordering defensive formations as crews struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. On the surface, the sky cleared slowly, unnatural colors fading back to familiar stars, and a stunned hush fell over the cities as people realized the annihilation had been stopped. Then someone began to cry, a raw, broken sound that turned into a chorus as the truth settled in that their salvation had been bought with a human life they would never be able to repay. Memorials sprang up spontaneously, symbols etched into stone and metal, not by decree but by instinct, honoring a woman they had never known but would remember forever. Dominion space went quiet for a time, their confidence shattered by the realization that humanity was willing to die not for conquest, but for strangers whose names they had only just learned. Across the galaxy, whispers spread of a species that answered ancient distress calls and paid in blood to keep their promises. But as recovery crews scanned the scar left by the collapse, faint, impossible readings flickered at the edge of detection. Signatures that suggested the Resolute had not been destroyed, but displaced, caught somewhere beyond normal space and time, where even the Dominion dared not look. Rourke stared at the data, heart pounding, realizing that the story might not be over at all.
The galaxy inhaled and held its breath in the aftermath, because wars usually left debris, treaties, borders redrawn in blood, but this had left a question mark burned into the fabric of space. The human fleet remained in orbit, silent and vigilant, while recovery operations began both above and below the planet. Captain Rourke authorized a system-wide stabilization effort, coordinating engineers, medics, and diplomats with the same intensity once reserved for combat. On the surface, the liberated people moved through open streets that no longer echoed with orders barked in foreign tongues, learning the strange, fragile freedom of choosing where to stand and when to speak. They told stories of the moment the sky folded, of the human ship that did not turn away, and those stories spread faster than any official broadcast ever could. In Dominion space, panic metastasized. Councils convened in emergency session, archives were scrubbed, and suppression constructs long hidden were quietly decommissioned out of fear that humanity might come looking for them next. Official statements dismissed the incident as an anomaly, a localized failure, but the truth leaked anyway,
through smugglers and analysts and terrified junior officials who could not keep the secret that an empire had blinked first. Across neutral systems, species that had never dared speak the word rescue aloud began to whisper it again. Rourke stood on the bridge of the replacement flagship, watching the scar in space where the Resolute had vanished, and ordered continuous scans, despite objections from physicists who insisted there was nothing to find. He trusted the data more than the theory, and the data refused to settle. There were echoes, rhythmic distortions that pulsed like a heartbeat, patterns too deliberate to be random. Humanity had named Project Long Echo for a reason, and it was becoming clear that echoes did not simply fade. On the planet, a provisional council formed from elders, workers, and scholars who had survived the occupation, their first act not vengeance, but communication, sending messages outward on every frequency the Dominion had once forbidden.
They spoke of what had been done to them and who had stood between them and extinction, and those messages were picked up by listeners far beyond their intended reach. The human fleet allowed it, understanding that stories were weapons of a different kind. Rourke addressed the people of the planet personally, promising continued protection and assistance, and reminding them that humanity did not claim ownership of what it saved. The words carried weight because they were backed by sacrifice. Somewhere deep in the data streams, comments began to flood in from other systems, reactions, theories, disbelief, hope, and Rourke realized the galaxy itself was starting a conversation it had avoided for centuries. He encouraged it quietly, knowing that shared stories built alliances faster than fleets ever could, and that once heard, the idea of help could not be silenced again. Dominion probes tested the edges of the system days later, cautious and distant, but retreated the moment human sensors locked onto them, unwilling to risk another confrontation. Analysts confirmed that the Empire was pulling back from fringe worlds, consolidating, afraid of what answering one ancient distress call had unleashed. Then the echoes intensified. Sensors across the fleet lit up as the scar pulsed brighter, space folding in on itself in miniature repetitions of the catastrophe that should have been impossible to replicate. Scientists argued, voices overlapping as theories collapsed under the weight of the readings, until Rourke ordered silence and focused on the pattern itself. It was structured, almost communicative, a signature that matched the Resolute's drive harmonics with unnerving precision. On the surface, sensitive instruments mirrored the readings, and the liberated people gathered again, looking skyward with a mix of awe and fear, wondering if the humans who had saved them were about to lose something else. Rourke authorized a controlled probe, a drone stripped of everything but sensors, and launched it toward the scar. As it crossed the threshold, its telemetry spiked, then stabilized, transmitting images that made the bridge go silent. There was something there, not empty space, not a grave, but a vast, shifting region of folded reality where time did not behave, and at its center, a familiar silhouette, battered but intact, the Resolute, and within it, a single life sign. The confirmation hit the bridge like a shock wave, not loud, not explosive, but paralyzing in its intensity. One life sign, singular, steady. Captain Rourke felt his knees weaken before training forced him upright, his hands gripping the rail as if the ship itself might drift away if he let go. The Resolute existed inside a pocket of folded space-time where seconds outside stretched into something unrecognizable within, a region no human vessel had ever entered intentionally. Physics teams spoke in hushed tones, warning that any attempt to extract the ship could tear the distortion wider, potentially destabilizing the system or worse, but Rourke barely heard them. All he could see was Admiral Cade's command signature, pulsing faintly on the display, proof that the woman who had anchored a singularity with her own ship was still alive.
Dominion intelligence noticed the surge almost immediately. Intercepted communications confirmed panic at the highest levels as analysts realized the suppression construct had not only failed, but had left behind a phenomenon humanity alone seemed willing to study. A new ultimatum circulated through Dominion channels, quieter than the last, offering recognition, territory, and reparations in exchange for humanity abandoning the system and sealing the scar permanently. It was fear speaking, not diplomacy. Rourke rejected it without reply. On the planet below, the people sensed the shift even before official word spread, gathering in plazas and open ground, staring at the sky where faint distortions rippled like heat haze. When Rourke addressed them, explaining that the human commander who had saved them might still be reachable, but that trying to bring her back could risk everything, the response was immediate and unanimous. They would not ask humanity to walk away. They had lived too long knowing what abandonment felt like. Elders who once forbade hope now demanded the chance to return it. Volunteers stepped forward, offering resources, labor, anything that might help stabilize the extraction. And for the first time, humans accepted help from those they had saved, not as beneficiaries, but as partners.
Rourke authorized the construction of a resonance lattice, an array of ships and ground-based anchors designed to mirror the distortion's frequency without forcing it open. It was a delicate plan, one that required patience over firepower, cooperation over command. Dominion observers watched in disbelief as humans and former slaves worked side by side, building something that was neither weapon nor fortress, but a bridge. As the lattice powered up, the scar responded, its pulses slowing, synchronizing, the folded space within becoming momentarily navigable. Rourke opened a direct channel, broadcasting into the distortion with no guarantee it would be heard. He told Cade that the planet was safe, that the people she had protected were standing free beneath open skies, and that if she could hear him, they were ready to bring her home. Inside the folded region, time shifted. For Cade, moments blurred and stretched as the Resolute drifted in a twilight between instants, her body sustained by emergency systems that should have failed long ago. When Rourke's voice cut through the haze, she laughed weakly, the sound echoing strangely in the warped corridors, and answered that she had never doubted humanity would come looking, just as she had never doubted they would stay. Dominion fleets began to mobilize at the edge of sensor range then, unable to tolerate the possibility that humanity could reclaim what had been lost beyond time itself. Rourke saw the buildup and understood that the final test was approaching, not of weapons, but of will. As the lattice locked phase with the distortion and the Resolute began to move, inch by impossible inch, back toward normal space, Dominion commanders issued one last order, preparing to fire on the scar itself and erase the proof of human defiance forever. Rourke gave the command to hold position, trusting that the galaxy was watching and that what happened next would decide far more than one rescue.
The Dominion fired because they could not imagine any other ending, and because empires that rule by fear believe destruction is the same as control. Their opening salvo tore across the system toward the scar, weapons calibrated not to win a battle, but to erase a possibility. And for a fraction of a second, it seemed the galaxy would choose silence over hope. Captain Rourke did not order a counterattack. He ordered broadcast. Every human ship, every restored tower on the planet below, every relay the Dominion had failed to jam went live at once, transmitting the same feed in real time across open channels. The lattice held steady as Dominion fire struck its outer edge, human vessels absorbing the impact without returning it, shields flaring as crews pushed systems past safe limits to keep the bridge intact. Rourke spoke calmly into the channel, his voice carrying not just to the attackers, but to every species listening, stating that the Dominion was attempting to destroy a rescue in progress, that the target was not a weapon but a survivor, and that humanity would not move.
The footage followed his words, showing the Resolute emerging slowly from the folded void, battered, scarred, unmistakably human. On the surface, millions watched the sky as the distortion brightened and a shape took form, and the people who had once been forbidden to look up raised their hands instead of hiding. Dominion commanders hesitated, seeing their actions reflected back at them by a watching galaxy, their narrative collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. Orders contradicted each other, weapons powered down and back up as fear crept into voices that had never known accountability. The Resolute broke free in a surge of distorted light, slipping back into normal space as the lattice collapsed gracefully around it, the scar sealing behind like a wound finally allowed to heal. Human ships moved instantly, forming a defensive shell, not aggressive, not triumphant, simply present. Inside the Resolute, Admiral Cade felt gravity return like an old friend and allowed herself to close her eyes for one long breath before opening a channel to Rourke. She told him he had done well, that the people were safe, and that it was good to be back among the living. The moment rippled outward, reactions flooding every network as worlds that had never believed in rescue saw it happen in real time. Comments, theories, arguments, and awe collided as the story spread faster than any fleet, and Rourke encouraged it openly, inviting the galaxy to speak, to remember, to share what it had just witnessed with anyone who still thought help was a myth. The Dominion withdrew without another shot, their fleets pulling back under the weight of exposure rather than defeat, knowing that every future threat would be measured against what they had just tried and failed to erase.
On the planet below, celebrations were quiet and profound. People standing beneath a clear sky that no longer felt dangerous, knowing that their ancestors' call had not vanished into the dark after all. Cade descended to the surface days later, walking among them not as a savior, but as a witness, accepting their thanks with humility and reminding them that humanity's promise was simple and terrifying in its consistency. If you call, we will come. It may take us time, we may arrive late, but we will arrive. As the human fleet prepared to depart, leaving defenses and allies behind rather than chains or flags, long-range sensors detected something new, thousands of faint signals igniting across the stars, old distress calls awakening as species who had given up dared to try again. Rourke watched the board light up and realized that answering one ancient call had changed the rules of the galaxy forever. Humanity did not rule the stars. Humanity listened. And somewhere in the dark, voices that had waited centuries began to speak again.